Greetings. This is Unit 7, Module 2, Session 4. The name of this home connection is Decimals on Number Lines and Grids. It's a 2-pager. Put your name and number at the top, please. This first one says to us, label each marked point on the number line with a decimal number. We've been working with a lot of fractions, but it wants decimals. Use tenths when you can and hundredths when you must. What does that mean? Here would be an example, and I'll maybe put this in a place where we're not going to interrupt learning, maybe in the middle of this letter here. Okay, so watch this. I could write this number, 1/10. I could write this as 0.1, but it's also the same as 10 hundredths, so I could write 0.10. They're the same number, written slightly different, okay? So what our assignment is saying that if you can, write it as tenths. But if you can't, you can use hundredths. What would be an example of one that you can't? Well, here, let me write this in blue a little bit lower. Like 11 hundredths, I can really only write that as 0.11. I can't write 0.1 because that's what we just said was that's 1/10, right? So 11 hundredths you can only write one way, but 1/10 can also be spelled as 10 hundredths, okay? So in this assignment, we have to make sure that we keep that in mind. So will you do that with me? I think so. So I look at this mark here, and I know that I'm counting to 1. If I were going to maybe color in the number of gaps, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I've divided this into 10 segments. So I'm working with tenths. And I know that every time I come across one that's pointed at the black lines, that's a tenth, okay? So like I have 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10, and 10/10 is 1. Did you notice that along the way, this one, this B, this one here lines up with one of our tenths, and so does D. It lines up perfectly with one of our tenths. So if I were to zoom in here and I wanted to figure out, well, gosh, what is this number? Well, this is 2/10. This must be 1/10, right? So I'm just going to kind of pencil this in here so my brain knows. So I've got like 0.1 would be here. We already did 0.2 right there, which means this one here has to be what? It has to be 0.3, okay? Now, if I continue going, this one here would be 0.4. This would be 0.5. This big black mark would be 0.6. This is going to be 0.7, which means D is going to be what? 0.8. Okay? So that is how I figured it out. Everything else that is not spelled out must be then hundredths, right? Because if it's not pointing at one of these tenths, like it's in between, like this is in between, C is in between, this example here was in between, it's not going to be able to be spelled out in tenths, like 0.2, 0.3, 0.8. I'm going to have to use the hundredths, okay? So let's take a look at A. Whoops, that didn't zoom in like I wanted it to. Well, I know that I'm counting by tenths. So each time or hundredths. So each time I go up one of these, I'm going up 1/100th, because each one of these little marks will get me a total of 100 by the time I get all the way to the end, okay? So let me get rid of this so I can get my brain going. So this would be, man, this is going to be hard to write. It's tiny, but this is 0.11. And then it goes 0.12, and then 0.13, and then 0.14. right? So as I go through all of these, counting all these marks, I have to figure out where to stop. Okay, so let's try this. I have 0.11, 0.12, 0.13, 0.14, 0.15, 0.16. 0.16. If you wanted to say it like it were hundredths, what would you say? Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let me put that back. Well, I would say 11 hundredths, 12 hundredths, 13 hundredths, 14 hundredths, 15 hundredths, 16 hundredths. Okay? I could think about it that way too. If I move down to our other blank, well, this is kind of nice because they already got us 53 hundredths, 54 hundredths, 55 hundredths, 56 hundredths, 57 hundredths, 58 hundredths. How do you write 58 hundredths? 0.58. That is 58 hundredths. And then is that the last one? I think that's the last one. So that's a really nice number line to look at because the bars really help you understand how you could take the number 1 and cut it into 100 little pieces. But along the way, you can have bigger dividers like the yellow ones here that cuts it up into 10 bigger pieces. Okay? Let's do this. Having trouble moving this page. Here we go. Write each number you labeled on the number line beside a grid below. Then shade in the grid to show the decimal amount and write a fraction to represent it. Oh my goodness. So we're going to take A, B, C, and D and write them on the lines corresponding to the letters. Okay? So let's see. So we've got, oh, this is going to be tricky, but I think I can do it. So my brain just can't remember. So this was, ooh, that's way thicker than I need it to be. Let's change that up, make it just a little smaller. Let's see, I have 0.16. B was 0.3. I had 0.58. And then the last one was 0.8. And remember how to say those. I have 16 hundredths, 3 tenths, 58 hundredths, and 8 tenths. So make sure we're saying them right. You could say 0.16, but really that is 16 hundredths. If you know how to say it, that makes writing the fraction easier. Over here, I have 3 tenths. A little lower, I have 58 hundredths. And then I have 8 tenths for D. Okay? It wants you to, if you take a look at the instructions one more time, it says, shade in the grid to show the decimal amount, and then we're going to write a fraction to represent it, which we already wrote the fraction because if you know how to say it, then you know how to do it. So that's just kind of the way I feel about it. So let's do some shading, and I got to make sure my shader is a lot smaller than it is right now. Maybe like that. We're about to find out because I'm going to zoom in. 16 hundredths. There are 100 squares on this grid. This grid represents 1, so there are 100 hundredths, which is 1. So if I'm going to do 16 of them, 16 hundredths, well then let's do 16 of them. I know that one row is 10, so that's 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. That is 16 hundredths. Okay? If I move over to B, 3 tenths, well, I know that every one of these rows represents a tenth because that's a 2 tenths, that's 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tenths. So each row or column represents tenths. And you could go this way in rows, and those would be tenths as well because there's 10 in each row, there's 10 in each column. This is a perfect square. But we need how many? 3 tenths. So I'm going to go 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, done. Looking at this one, it says 58 hundredths. So I'm going to do 58 little squares. I know that one column is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and now I need 8 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That is 58 hundredths. Or you could think of it as 58 out of the 100 squares. All right, finally, if we go over to D, what are we going to have here? It says 8 tenths. Remember, one column is a tenth. How many tenths do you need? It says to do 8. So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Ta-da! Nice work. And that, wow, that's it on that page? I can't believe that. Okay, well, we better keep going. Here on the second page, it's similar, but look at the little difference here. It says, shade each fraction on the grid. That's step 1. Then write an equivalent fraction and 2 decimal numbers that represent the same amount. So look at this example. It said shade 20 hundredths, and that's what they did. They did 10 20 of the 100 squares. You could write that as 2 tenths, or you could write it as both of the decimals. This says 2 tenths, which is what it says right here, and this says 20 hundredths, which is what it says there. Oh my goodness, it all matches. Okay, so I'm going to do one of them with you, and I'm going to allow you to do the other 2. So let's get going. 4 tenths. Do not forget that one column is a tenth. So that's 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths. If we wanted to write this as another fraction, okay, what would we write? Well, the only other thing we can do if we've already done tenths is hundredths, right? So how many of the 100 squares did we just highlight? Well, it looks like we did 10, 20, 30, 40 squares. So we would write 40 hundredths. Now that we have done the fraction versions, 4 tenths, 40 hundredths, just write the decimal versions below. So I'm going to write 4 tenths as 0.4, and I'm going to write 40 hundredths as 0.40. All of the things that we just wrote are the same thing spelled differently. 4 tenths is us looking at the columns. 40 hundredths is us counting the individual squares, although it is the same amount. And then 0.4 is 4 tenths. 0.40 is 40 hundredths. We just wrote all of the equivalents of the same shading. Okay? I'm going to allow you to do the same for B and C on your own. Please pause this video and give it a try. Write an inequality symbol, which would be like a less than or a greater than sign, to show which fraction is greater and which is less. I'm going to really encourage you to do what we did earlier in the year, which is to do your zeros rule so that they match. So if one of the numbers is hundredths and the other is tenths and you're trying to compare them, the easiest thing to do would be to add a 0 to your tenths, making sure you do it to the numerator and the denominator, and then you can just compare the top numbers and say what's larger. Okay, and since we know that 40 is larger than 20, the alligator is going to eat the larger number. Okay, same thing here. I see tenths, I'm going to convert them to hundredths, and then I know that 70 is larger than 30, so I'm going to write my sign this way, so the alligator eats the larger number. Okay, I'm going to let you do the next 2 on your own. You should pause this video and give it a try. And then the same thing is going to happen on 5, because it looks like, well, sort of. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but for example, I would write the fraction so you know what you're looking at. Okay, 40 hundredths is this, but this says 4 hundredths. I'm hoping that as you look at these 2 numbers, you would say, well, 40 hundredths has to be more than 4 hundredths, so the alligator is going to eat the bigger number. This is one that I'm going to help you with, and then I'm going to let you do the other 2 on your own. I'm looking at 0.89 versus 0.9. At first glance, you would say, well, 89 is larger than 9. But if I think about it this way, they're easier to compare. Because what do I have? I have 89 hundredths versus 90 hundredths. Now, if you identify which number is larger, I'm hoping that you would say, well, 90 is larger than 89. So you need to make sure that you're comparing hundredths to hundredths. If I were to ignore this completely, it's really easy to think that 9/10 could be smaller than 89 hundredths. But as long as you stay on track with it, I don't think it'll trip you up. Pause this video and do the next two. Okay, check this out. Drew says 3/10 plus 28 hundredths equals 31 hundredths. Sam says 3/10 plus 28 hundredths equals 58 hundredths. We need to know who's correct. Well, don't you think we could use our information from up here when we were using our zeros rule, how we added zeros to make them comparable? I think now is the time to use it. And I'm just going to hop in here and see if it's true. So if I were to think about the answer is in hundredths, so maybe I should make sure the number that is not in hundredths is, I can add zeros to these, and now I have 30 hundredths plus 28 hundredths. Well, I kind of think that there's something up here because 30 plus 28 is not 31. 30 plus 28 is 58. So that answer should be 58 hundredths. So I don't agree with Drew's answer. On this side, I kind of do agree, though, because if I do the same thing over here, I think he did the math correctly because 30 plus 28 is 58. That's the number we were hoping for. So who would you say is correct? Hopefully Sam. Oops, I meant to circle it and I didn't. How do you know? Well, if you rewrote your problem to point out how this is wrong and you rewrote your problem to point how this is right, you're going to probably want to include something about our zeros rule, or maybe your teacher calls it a zeros strategy, or maybe they call it secret math. They call it all sorts of different things. But that's going to be what you want to write down for your explanation. Okay, if you have questions, as usual, please ask a math wizard. Your teachers love to help you with math. Do not forget that. Check you later.